the number, then your first and last name. When you hover over your picture, there should be 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner. When you click on these, you should see rename at the bottom of the list. If you need your CISA number, just let us know in the chat, please. And then two notes on Zoom etiquette. Please mute your mic unless you are asking a question, and then we invite you to turn your cameras on. So welcome everyone to the Special Ed and Pupil Services Leadership Academy. This academy is brought to you by the partnerships between the Wisconsin Regional Special Education Network, or the RSN, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and the Wisconsin Council of Administrators of Special Services, or WCAS. I am Rachel Kotarabik, the RSN for CISA 7. We are excited to have so many of you join us, and I see the waiting room continues to have people join. The format for this year is a little different than in the past, as we strive to be more inclusive and meet the needs of all of our Wisconsin directors. Our agenda for these academies is full for this year, but we aim to be responsive to the needs in the field. So given this, we have added an hour to the February 7th session, which will now be from 9 to noon, to provide you with timely and relevant information. Just a quick reminder that WCAS is offering WCAS conversations from 12 to 1 the day after these sessions. So the next conversation is tomorrow, December 7th. And the topic is special education open enrollment, some things to consider, communicating to the board, staff, and parents, with special guests Hannah Chin from the School District of Whitefish Bay, and Mark, I'm not even sure how to say his last name, from Von Briesen and Roper. Again, that is tomorrow from noon to 1 with WCAS. Also, just a quick plug and reminder that WCAS is offering a 5-part legal series that began back in October. And some of the topics are understanding new and proposed Section 504 regs, FBAs and BIPs, using student needs to determine the LRE, parent relationships, expulsion, abeyance, shortened day. So a lot of hot topics there as well in their 5-part learning series. For today, we would like to remind you that we have a participant folder. The agenda has been in the chat. Thanks, Deb, for dropping that in continuously, and the folder is linked there. And that we also have a parking lot, so you can add your unanswered questions in this document. Myself and the rest of the team try to monitor the chat as well. But oftentimes when people are presenting, they don't have time to just answer questions. So we do try to put those in the parking lot. So be sure to check back if your question was unanswered during the session. And contact information there is if you prefer, but certainly that does give us a way to get in touch with you if needed. So today, kind of our overview, we have open enrollment for about the first 45 minutes. We'll take about a 10-minute break, and then we will talk joint federal notifications. So to start us off, we should have Jen Demro and another last name I'm not sure, Carrie Steven. Sorry, Carrie.
That's okay.
I should have asked how to say it before I introduced you. So Carrie and Jen, I will stop my share and welcome you to share your screen if you have a PowerPoint or slide, and I'll let you take over from here.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for having us today. We're so happy to join you. I'm Carrie Santasteven, and I'm here this morning with my colleagues, Jennifer Demerow and Kelly Reinhardt. We are all school administration consultants on the Parental Education Options team at DPI. And we are here to talk this morning about open enrollment and making special education space determinations. I'm going to start us off this morning with a quick overview of the open enrollment program, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen to discuss making open enrollment space determinations at a January school board meeting. Jen will lay out the steps districts should be taking to successfully determine open enrollment special education space, including reviewing your open enrollment policies, establishing space criteria, and documenting your space determinations in the minutes from the school board meeting. Then we'll finish out our discussion with a review of some other important consideration for school districts. Please feel free to submit any questions through the chat, and we'll get those answered right away. And I'm sure we'll have some time at the end for any discussion or additional questions. So let's get started. So just as a quick refresher, public school open enrollment is a program that allows parents to apply for their children to attend a public school in a different school district other than the one in which they live. Any Wisconsin resident with children in grades 4K through 12 may apply. For early childhood and 4K, the student would only be eligible for open enrollment if the resident district offers the same type of program, and the student must be eligible for the program in the resident district. The same type of program for pre-kindergarten and 4K means that the programs in both districts are eligible for state aid, and for early childhood, it means that both districts can provide all the services required in the student's IEP. So there's two open enrollment application periods. The first, which is coming up here in just a few months, that's the regular application period. This year, it'll run from February 5th through April 30th. And the regular application period is always for the upcoming school year. The second application period is the alternative application process, which always starts on July 1st, and it runs until the end of the school term. That application process allows parents to apply for the current school year. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she is going to discuss making your space determinations.
Thanks, Carrie. So per open enrollment state law, non-resident school boards are required to designate both regular and special education spaces that they will have available for the next school year at a January board meeting. What we mean by special education space, it's really determined by programs or services. Programs and services really mean the same thing, the special education services provided by the LEA or the local education agency. And when the law says January, it does actually mean January. There does have to be a determination made at a January board meeting. Now, the board can certainly meet in November, December to start to discuss what they're going to be doing, how they're going to be looking at the spaces, whether or not there's going to be policy changes or criteria changes before January, but the actual determination itself has to be made at a January meeting. Boards must specify criteria in their open enrollment policy. That is the criteria that they're going to be using to determine those spaces. The criteria must be applied consistently so that decisions on space are not going to be considered arbitrary or unreasonable. And one of the most common reasons that we overturn open enrollment denials due to space would be that the district and the board did not follow their criteria. The regular education and special education space determinations are actually two separate determinations. A non-resident school board could determine that they don't want to limit regular ed spaces, but they choose to limit special education spaces, which is allowed in state law. So if the board does not intend to deny applicants due to regular education or special education space, they need to make sure that they make that determination, and it has to be documented in its January board minutes. It's important to remember that even if the board has indicated that there is no special education space available, the district must still review each applicant's IEP in its entirety to determine whether or not it can meet all of the needs of the students. They can determine when they're looking at that IEP whether or not the district has space in the services required, or whether they actually have the special education and the related services. The board should not make any assumptions about the special education or related services the student needs based on the identified disability. We have had instances where the district has denied a student's application without reviewing the IEP, which could obviously be considered discriminatory. If the school board wants to consider whether or not there is space available in special education or the related services required in the student's IEP, the board must specify this in its policy as well in its criteria when it's making those determinations. So on appeal, we wanted to make it known that DPI, we are required to affirm a school board's decision unless we find that that decision was arbitrary or unreasonable. That comes directly from open enrollment state law. What this means is that we're most likely to uphold a denial decision by a district and a board if both of the following are true: that the board's policy and criteria follow state law and it's not arbitrary or unreasonable, and two, that the board properly and consistently applied its criteria and policy and followed state law and its policies in determining application decisions. Examples of actions that have been found to be arbitrary and unreasonable by DPI on appeal include that the board did not follow open enrollment state law, the board did not have a required policy on which the decision was made, the board used criteria that were arbitrary or unreasonable, the board did not follow its policy or was inconsistent with its policy or made arbitrary or unreasonable exceptions to it, and the board did not establish the number of spaces, special education spaces available in the district. Instead, the board limited the number of students it would accept based on the student's identified disability. Before a district can make their January space determination, the district needs to review its open enrollment policy and criteria. So what are some of the key items that should be in a district's open enrollment policy? So the policy may not specify that it cannot provide services to students with a specific disability. The policy can only consider the availability of space in special education or related services. The board's policy, criteria, or board minutes cannot state the district will not take any students with IEPs, as this is a discriminatory statement. And honestly, we have seen that where districts will make that statement on their board minutes. If the school board wants to make any changes to its open enrollment policy, this must be done before the regular application period begins, which for the 24-25 school year is February 5th. So now is the time to be reviewing your policies and make any changes for the upcoming regular application period, because again, those have to be implemented and adopted by the board before the first Monday in February. Even though statute permits the consideration of space, a board may only deny for that reason if it adopts the reason in policy. That means that although statute permits a school board to deny open enrollment if special education space is not available, the board may only do so if it adopts a space criterion in its policy. It is outlined in state law that the non-resident school board must adopt a policy that specifies that it will consider the availability of space when approving and denying applications. It must establish space criteria, which must include the description of the criteria and what the criteria are that will be used to determine the availability of space. The policy must specify whether currently attending applicants and/or siblings of currently attending students will be granted a preference or a guarantee, and it must provide for a waiting list if the board desires to have one. So DPI does not have any model policies on making space determinations for regular education or special education for open enrollment. We also do not approve district policies as a matter of course. However, we can review them and give our opinion. We cannot give legal opinions or legal advice, and we will direct districts to speak to their school board's attorney for legal advice. We also cannot guarantee that if we review your policy that it will stand up during an appeal. So if an application denial is appealed, DPI will review your board's policy and criteria to ensure that it has not been applied in an arbitrary or an unreasonable manner. Again, we're required by law to affirm the district if they did not act arbitrary or unreasonable. So this next slide shows a policy that I would consider an acceptable open enrollment policy because it describes the special education denial reasons that are allowed per state law. In reviewing a policy when we receive an appeal at DPI, we look to see the following. Does the school board have a policy? Does the policy permit the board to deny an application for special education reasons? Is the policy in compliance with state law? And does the board have specific criteria in policy, rule, or other materials? Next, I'm going to move on to criteria. So if the board wishes to consider whether there is space to provide special education or related services, it has to specify what criteria it will use. That criteria must be outlined in the board's open enrollment policy, and it must be followed exactly and consistently. There are no state or federal special education caseload requirements. Local school districts are responsible for determining policies and criteria related to space staff capacities to provide special education services. There is no single way to calculate special education caseloads or staffing needs. Districts may use any method if IEPs are fully implemented and the services in each student's IEP are provided by appropriately licensed staff. The board is able to use whatever they want to in order to determine the available spaces. However, they must be able to explain how they came to this number and defend it in case of an appeal. So some of the items that could be included in a board's criteria would be class size limits or pupil-teacher ratios, caseload or staffing capacity limits, which could include the amount of services the students may need, class or group size based on the intensity of the pupil's needs, or the type of staff to address various disability-related needs. Some other possible criteria could be projected pupil enrollment and changes to services in pupils' IEPs, or any other considerations concerning availability of space in special education or related services. So the criteria that the board chooses to select may not include any limitations that are based on pupils' eligibility category labels. It cannot be based on limitations that are based on IDEA environmental codes. And it also cannot include any limitations related to transportation. A non-resident school board cannot deny an application solely on the basis that transportation is a related service in a pupil's IEP or that the transportation cost is high. Per state law, if a student with a disability has transportation as a related service on their IEP, the non-resident district must provide it. Both state and federal laws prohibit discrimination against a student based on the student's physical, mental, emotional, or learning disability. So the board may not deny open enrollment based on a student's eligibility for or the need of a reasonable accommodation in the Section 504 plan. So open enrollment state law is very specific regarding the definition of a student with a disability, and there's no reference related to a Section 504 plan. So when a district receives an application from a student with a 504 plan who has not been found eligible for special education under Chapter 115, or does not have a referral for an initial evaluation by a special education team, that student must be treated as a student without a disability. This is an example of an acceptable open enrollment criteria. That explains how special education space determinations can be calculated. It's acceptable because it specifically describes what the board will consider in determining special education space availability and what the specific process will be to get to that determination. As a reminder, the specific criteria that the board has approved to use for space determinations must be outlined in their open enrollment policy. Next, I want to touch a little bit on contracted services since we do get this question asked. sometimes. So a non-resident school board isn't required to designate special education spaces if it contracts outside of the district for services because the programs are not available in the district. If the board contracts for services outside of the district and the student's IEP requires these services, the board may deny the application for special education services not available, not for no special education space availability. So again, if you contract out, it means that you obviously don't have those services in your district, so you could deny for that reason. Or your board could choose to approve those applications for students that require those contracted services that isn't available in the district. So if the board determines that it wants to approve those applications, they can do so, but they're required to designate special education spaces for those specific services based on the contract that they have in place with the contracted vendor. So finally, I'm going to talk about the space determinations, what the board minutes should look like, and then we will provide some examples to you. So the board action has to be reflected in its board minutes. Again, we're talking about the January board meeting. The minutes must reflect the actual number of spaces by special education program or service for which a caseload or class size can be established. The board can consider the level of service it's able to provide. It's not necessarily, it's not necessary to designate special education spaces by grade, but you can. The minutes should not simply refer to the board passing a motion related to open enrollment spaces. We'll see that often. We'll see a summary where it'll state the board members so-and-so and so-and-so, brought the motion forward. The rest said yay. It actually has to spell out those services and programs and then what those decisions were made for space. So it's not enough to actually state that the board accepted the administration's recommendations unless those written recommendations are an official part of the record. The minutes or other official record of the meeting must include the written criteria and calculations upon which the number of spaces were determined. So this is an example of an acceptable open enrollment space determination described in the January board minutes of a board. I removed the specific information regarding regular education since this presentation is really about special education spaces. So this district criteria was included in their open enrollment policy, and it was what I referred to as an acceptable criteria in earlier slides. So if you look at this example, it does show that a motion was made by a particular person, and then it was seconded, and then the motion was carried. But down below, you will actually see what the board approved as far as an exact number of seats in what program or service. And then the board also included if they do not have those spaces in those categories listed below. Now here's an example of an unacceptable space determination as described in a board's minutes. The reason should be obvious, but we have seen this in the past. It's unacceptable because it directly refers to disability categories, not caseloads or class sizes. The final part I want to talk about are space determinations and alternative applications because there is some confusion on that topic. So after the January board meeting and up until June 30th, so the end of the school year, a non-resident school board may approve an alternative application submitted for the current school year if the board did not limit the number of spaces available in the pupil succeeding grade or special education service for applications submitted under the regular application period for the following school year. So what does that mean? So for example, if a school board determines that they don't have any spaces available for speech and language for the upcoming school year of 24-25, the non-resident district may not approve any alternative applications for the current school year, so 23-24, for any students who need special education for speech and language as part of their IEP, once that January board meeting has taken place and the board has adopted those spaces. In a similar vein, from July 1st through the third Friday in September, the non-resident school board may only approve an alternative application for the current school year in the pupil's grade or special education service that does not have space limitations established by the board for the following school year. So what this means is that if a board determines there's no spaces again in speech and language for 24-25, and then the non-resident district receives an application on July 1st for a student who needs speech and language, they must deny that application for no special education space being available. And finally, what happens when a non-resident school district, they've made their January space determinations, but they get an alternative application after third Friday? Well, those space determinations in January are only good until the third Friday in September. So this is what we like to call the loophole time. So when an alternative application is received by a non-resident district after third Friday, but before the January board meeting is occurring for those next school year space determinations, the district can look at their numbers at the time of application to determine whether or not they have space in the special education services, or they can continue to use those determinations for January. So it's really up to the board how they wish to proceed. Again, this is after third Friday because those numbers technically expired from January. So now I'm going to hand it back off to Carrie, and she's going to be talking about some important considerations, some other various topics regarding open enrollment.
Thanks, Jen. So let's take a look at some important considerations that districts should keep in mind when working with open enrollment. And the first one is reviewing a student's IEP. It's important to remember, and this was mentioned earlier in the presentation, and this was a question that popped up in the chat as well, that even if the board has indicated there is no special education space available, the district must still review each applicant's IEP in its entirety to determine whether it can meet the needs of the student. So for example, upon review of a student's IEP, it may be determined that the student has a specific learning disability and their IEP requires specially designed reading instruction. The district has an SLD licensed teacher and their caseload is full, but you determine that one of the cross-categorical teachers in the district can provide the required services. As a result, you can approve the student's application since the district can provide all the student's special education and related services. So another consideration is preference and guarantees, and Jen touched on this as well, but we just want to remind districts that if the school board guarantees approval of currently attending students or their siblings, that means it must guarantee all currently attending students and or their siblings. This includes students with disabilities. If there is a guarantee, the non-resident district cannot deny the application due to no space. However, it can deny the application due to special education services not being available in the district, which is different than no space being available. Now, if your board policy specifies that the district may guarantee approval of applications from currently attending students or their siblings, the board must decide at the January school board meeting if it will offer a guarantee or stick to just granting preference. If the board does not specify whether they will offer the guarantee or preference, then the district is prohibited from guaranteeing approval of applications. The district can only give preference to applications from currently attending students and siblings of currently attending students. Another consideration we want to keep in mind, and this is when we're talking about continuing open enrolled students and terminating open enrollment. So a district's space determinations are only for new applicants, and those space determinations expire as of the third Friday in September. When a continuing open enrolled student has an IEP developed or revised, the district is not bound by those January space determinations. Under state law, the district may continue to serve the student. At the time of the IEP development or revision, if the district determines that space is not available in the programs or services required in the IEP, or that the programs or services are not available in the district, then the district may terminate the student's open enrollment. This determination can only be made after the IEP team has met to revise or develop the IEP and determine the student's needs have changed such that different services are now required. If the IEP team determined the student has new or different disability-related needs that require changes to the frequency, duration, amount, or location of IEP services, the student's open enrollment can be terminated if the non-resident district determines that they do not have the space or services required in the student's IEP. Also to note, and this has come up quite a bit actually, a student's open enrollment cannot be terminated due to staffing issues. It can only be terminated if the IEP has been developed or revised. And we strongly suggest that districts use the DPI termination templates that are available on our website rather than crafting your own letter, as they do include all of the information required under law. And they also omit information that should not be mentioned in a termination letter. So the final consideration that we wanted to mention to districts is about tuition waivers. And when we talk about tuition waivers, we are talking about resident students who move out of your district, but they want to stay attending. A student's eligibility for a tuition waiver is based solely on the date of move, the date they move out of the district. And we do have a tuition waiver matrix on our website, which is actually a great tool to use when you're trying to figure out whether a student qualifies for a tuition waiver, if you should use a tuition waiver, or if you should be using an alternative open enrollment application. So a tuition waiver permits a student who moves out of the district to remain in the district long enough so that they can apply for open enrollment during the next regular open enrollment application period. That eligibility is based on the student's date of move. It is not based on your open enrollment space or a student's disability status. Students with disabilities are eligible to attend a district on a tuition waiver based on their date of move. So I'm just going to reiterate that again. Tuition waivers are not tied to your open enrollment space determinations. And if your district does not have special education open enrollment space, that doesn't matter. Students with disabilities can qualify for a tuition waiver, and it's just based on the date of move. When a student moves out of the school district prior to the third Friday in September, you should have the parent complete an alternative open enrollment application. If the application gets denied, then the district would determine if the student may qualify for a tuition waiver. They might qualify for an additional year waiver or a current year waiver. Just keep in mind for the additional year waivers, those have to be submitted to DPI because those are funded just the same as open enrollment. And we want to be sure that you get paid for the student. So we do the aid calculation for districts. Additional reminders on tuition waivers. Students who move out of your district after the third Friday in September who would like to stay attending your district, they can finish out the school year on a current year tuition waiver. Please do not have the parent complete an alternative application. Students on a current year waiver have already been counted in your membership report, so your district has already raised revenue for these students. The students will be treated as residents for the remainder of the school year on a current year waiver. The reason you don't do an alternative application is because, like I said, your district has already raised revenue for the student, and we wouldn't want to charge another school district an open enrollment amount when the student has already been counted. And just as a reminder, districts will want to reach out to parents who have children attending on waivers to let them know that that waiver is only good for that one school year. And in order for the student to continue attending the district, they will need to apply for open enrollment for the upcoming school year. So in closing, we wanted to provide you with some links to additional resources on our website, as well as our contact information. We are always happy to assist districts with questions and concerns. And we are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for letting us join you today.
Thank you so much, Carrie and Jen. And I think I heard a third voice in there. Much appreciated. One of the questions that came in for me was specifically around the space determination sample criteria. In the bottom paragraph, it said if the projected caseload for any special ed teacher or related service provider is below DPI caseload recommendations, space will be available to provide that specific type of special ed or related services. Is that specifically referring to the ones from back in 2004, or is that 2015? Can you just provide a little clarity around what that might be referring to?
Yeah, that's what it was referring to. I should have updated that because those are gone now. So I don't even think those are up on the website. But before, and I think there are still some districts that are using that, I don't want to say antiquated, but out of date caseload recommendations. They certainly can still do so. It's just, it would be really difficult to kind of get those to fit as to where, disability, the categories and things like that are at this time in caseloads as well. So we'll have to update that. Thank you for whoever caught that. We will update that and take that out of there.
No problem. Thanks for the clarification. Much
Sure.
appreciated.
Yep.
We are a little bit ahead of schedule. We can certainly open the floor if anyone has any other clarifying questions or questions for these fine presenters in the next few minutes. I've been kind of watching chat and I think some of it hopefully was answered.
I do see a question that's in the chat about terminating due to attendance. And yes, a school district can terminate open enrollment due to habitual truancy. And that would happen at the end of a semester or at the end of the school year.
Thank you, Carrie. And I see Connie, you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick clarifying question, Jen.
Hi, Connie.
I talk to you a lot because I always just want to triple check. And
Sure.
I know you've answered this before, but I want to triple check. And I just want to use an example, and it's not an example we have, but let's say we have a student that's currently attending and he's referred for special education. It is deemed that he needs special education services, right? So then we have, let's say at the evaluation meeting, we have the IEP, but parents have not quite consented they haven't consented for special ed or signed the papers yet for it, but we have to review the IEP. You had mentioned if we don't have spaces, we can then deny that student if we review and send them back to their resident school district. But you had mentioned something about the placement page in a question, and I'm very confused at how it looks as we're going through the actual meeting and the process.
Yeah, so I've asked that question to DPI special education team because really this is their wheelhouse, not ours.
Uh-huh.
And my understanding was that there should not be a placement made on that page if you're going to be terminating the student's open enrollment. That's my understanding, but I would see clarification with that with DPI special education
Okay.
team.
Okay.
Because they're going to be the ones, because again, this is very specific to an IEP development that's kind of
Yep.
outside my
Okay.
realm of understanding. I'm an
Okay.
expert on some things, but not
So
that.
we just want really what they're saying, and I can reach out to them, is we wouldn't put anything on the placement
I
page.
believe so,
Okay.
but I would get
I'll do-
clarification
yep.
on that.
Yep.
Yeah.
I will.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Hey, is Erin from DPI still available on here? I just have
I
a
am.
question
I was
for
just
her.
going to drop in the chat.
I was going to ask you about that because I know that there was some work being done on some sort of workload guidance, correct?
There is, yes, and I am not the owner of that. So if Connie, if you want to reach out to me, I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and then I can connect with the proper people on our team and make sure that we get that information to you.
And also in the chat, Gail Anderson has put that DPI does have that workload guidance. If you're a WCAS member, there are some workload tools available to WCAS members in their member portal. And then it looks like there's a question up in CISA 9.
I just wanted to ask about the guarantee and preference. When you write that, you can't write two separate ones. Say you have numbers in regular ed and numbers in special ed. Is it, if you're guaranteeing it's both areas, right? Or preference, you can't say guarantee regular ed and preference in special ed, right?
Correct. Correct.
So I wanted to make
It's
sure.
all or nothing, basically. But you can separate out between currently attending and siblings. So you could say, we're going to guarantee currently attending, but that would be all currently attending applicants, but we're going to give preference to siblings. And that would be all siblings. So you
Oh,
can divide it
okay.
out that way. You just can't divide it out between regular education and special education. And I will say majority of districts, if they're going to have a guarantee, it's going to be for currently attending applicants because that's a known number that's already existing in, your classrooms, and you already will have known those numbers. Siblings is a little less frequent. We see it from time to time, but definitely currently attending applicants is the guarantee that we see more often.
Certainly an area where I think people still have questions or need clarification. So thank you so much. And we appreciate that you're willing to take questions on the fly. I know that's not always the easiest thing to do. If participants have further questions, we invite you to add them to the parking lot document. And we can certainly touch base with our presenters this morning. But otherwise, unless there's further comments, we will return from break at 11 o'clock. So anything further, Jen or Carrie, thanks so much.
Nope,
If
not from
not,
us.
thank you
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you so much.
again to our participants. We will return promptly at 11.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Of you who might have been feeling the winter chill, that last song there was called Tropic Summer Breeze. So I hope you were channeling your inner warmth or picturing sun and sand. But welcome back. We are going to head into the second half of our morning here with joint federal notifications and that packet release. We have Jeremiah, I believe, Seth, and Chua with us this morning. So I'm not sure who plans to screen share, but welcome to all of you and your team. And we're excited to hear, I think we're excited to hear about joint federal notifications. On my team, if somebody just wants to hit record again.
I did.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that. Is it good if we go ahead and get started or?
That'd be fantastic. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Well, actually, today we've brought a few colleagues of ours today. Seth, unfortunately, is not feeling well, so he will not be joining today's presentation, which is more than fine. We want him to rest up. And then any questions that folks have around or the data questions around IDA, that is something that I could definitely help you all kind of bring that over to Seth upon his return. But I do have here with us my colleagues, Jeremiah Jackson, as well as I believe Gloria Rashke, and I'm not able to see all the participants, but Ben Ketterer, and then maybe Amy Bethel from our Title I team as well. What I can do is start doing a share screen. All right, let's try to see if this works. Just because I use Teams so often.
We can see your screen. If you can just hit slideshow in the upper right-hand corner, it will make it much larger for us.
For sure. All right.
Thank you.
Folks seeing this good?
Yep, it's good on our end.
Perfect. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for having us here this morning to join you all to have a little bit of a dialogue and also some shared learning around joint federal notifications. My name is Maitra Tao. I'm one of the education consultants here on our special education team. And one of my most significant, I would say, roles here at the agency is really around providing support to districts around their joint federal notifications and monitoring supports for continuous improvement. And then as I noted earlier, I do have a few colleagues here with me today who will also be joining in today's presentation. So I'm going to give them each an opportunity to just do a brief introduction, maybe name, title, role, your choice, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jeremiah Jackson, and then we can kind of do a popcorn style and pass it along to our Title I colleagues. Jeremiah?
Hey, good morning to you all. My name is Jeremiah Jackson, one of the consultants on the special education team, primarily focused on racial disproportionality. It's pretty much my main task right now. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all this morning. So with that, I guess I can pass it to, who should I pass it to, Matia? Because I can't see anyone right now.
I would say Gloria, maybe?
There you go. Yeah, Gloria, you got it.
Hi, thank you for having me in this space to share with you all. My name is Gloria Guadalupe Rashke, and I am the Assistant Director of the Title I Continuous Improvement Team, and will be presenting on behalf of my team around the SI identifications. I also have another teammate here who will be supporting questions that may come up at the end. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Bethel. I'm a consultant on the Title I Continuous Improvement Team and working with identified schools, particularly those with targeted identifications. Is there anyone else, or should I pass it back to you, Maitra?
I think that's it.
Are we good? Is Ben joining us today or no?
We're good.
Okay, we're good. Perfect. All right, I'll go ahead and move along with today's presentation. Well, so before we get started, I thought we at least define what do we mean by joint federal notifications? What is joint federal notifications? Joint federal notifications, or JFN, is often, it refers to the annual district and school identification reports under two major federal laws: the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDA, and also the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. The JFN reports are released, as you all may know, at two different stages. So there's the preliminary, and then there's also the final stage. This year, as you all may have heard in our communications, that is going to be shifting at a much different timeline, where the preliminary will be released sometime in February, and then the final will take place in April, respectively. Before we dive into the two federal legislations here, as you're seeing on the screen, I really want to lay out kind of the reason as to why this work is joined in the first place. Especially if you're kind of wondering, well, you know, these are two vast, really big federal programs. Why is this work being spearheaded in a joint fashion? And, you know, to the work that we're doing at a SCA level, how we see this, and based off from the data, is that really these two laws are civil rights laws. At the heart of it is to serve students who are and have been historically marginalized. Based on the data that we're seeing when we investigate and when we look into as to why districts are being identified under IDA and ESSA, the data really tells us a story around the students that keep showing up time and time again, specific student populations that is of concern, that at the same time are historically marginalized student populations. So our students with IEPs, our students of color, and also our multilingual students. And this is what the data has revealed to us at SCA level. And so the really centered equity focused lens here around doing this work jointly is imperative, obviously, to meet the needs of all of our students, so that all of our students can recognize their right to a free and appropriate public education. So I really want to lay out that framework, that kind of grounding around why it is that we do a lot of this work at a joint level between IDA and ESSA identifications at the release of these reports. So first thing first is I'll talk a little bit around IDA, kind of the impetus behind that, the legislation, and what those identifications are and what they look like. The legislation, as I noted earlier, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The goal of IDA is to provide students with disabilities a free and appropriate public education. When the reports are released for IDA, the reports are calculated and disseminated at a district level reporting versus ESSA, which Gloria will talk a little bit about that occurring at a school level. And then the identifications under IDA, there are actually two major identifications. There's the LEA determinations that I work primarily in, and then there's the Racial Equity and Special Education report that my colleague Jeremiah really provides leadership and really holds the hat to that. So for LEA determinations, there are 4 categories that a district can, based on the data that they submit to DPI, and then our calculations and scoring of those data, they can fall into these buckets. They can either meet requirements, which is around a little bit more than 300, I think maybe a little bit more than 350 even, of our school districts that actually, meets requirements, and therefore there's no required actions of the district. And then the rest of the districts in the state of Wisconsin really falls into the other 3 categories of either needing assistance. And as you all know, there's it gets more intricate than this, but there's needs assistance year 1, or if you're identified again, that is where required actions is being asked of the LEA when they are identified as needs assistance year 2 plus. The 3rd category is the needs intervention category, and then the 4th one is the needs substantial intervention. Oftentimes, if you are a district that's been in the needs intervention category, but that category hasn't been shifted year after year, and it's after 3 consecutive years, that is when the required actions look really, really different for these school districts, along with districts who are in the last category, needs substantial intervention. Oftentimes, those required actions really look into, obviously, DPI directing what we call a corrective action plan, or a CAP, along with a few other requirements as well, and possibly of withholding funds and things like that, or a referral to the Department of Justice. But again, those numbers are much smaller in our state, and our work, I think, primarily around districts with needs assistance year 2 plus, is really working with these districts so that it doesn't get to those other 2 categories, where there is then a much more kind of customized, narrowed relationship and partnership between DPI and the districts. And then finally, for the racial equity and special education, the report is released at a district level, and then differently from the LEA determinations report, it's really just a yes or no. So either you've been identified for racial significant disproportionality and the various identifications like discipline placement. And so I believe every LEA gets this in Jeremiah will talk a little bit about the racial equity report in the later half of the presentation. But in terms of the categories itself, it's either that you've, that you have an identification in the racial equity report or you don't. And then we'll also dive into the required actions of both of the identifications under IDA in a little bit later in today's presentation. So that kind of gives you a bird's eye view, at least on the IDEA side in this joint work, the legislation, what the goal and purpose is, and then how it gets reported and the different types of identifications under IDEA. I know that was a handful. Feel free, folks, to enter your questions into the chat. We'll go ahead and answer that. Rachel, is that something that you all have discussed about? I didn't connect with Aaron about this, but are you all folks allowing participants to ask questions throughout the presentation, or do you all want to kind of wait until the end of the presentation?
That's entirely up to you, my Chua and team. Certainly we've invited people to put them in the chat. We also have a parking lot, so if it's easier to let you get through your content, we're kind of keeping an eye on chat and can bring that back at the end then if there's time for questions.
Okay. All right. I think that's probably best then, if we could do that.
Perfect. Then we'll keep an eye on chat and the parking lot for you for the end.
Thank you. All right. With that said, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Gloria to provide an overview around ESSA identification.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, the general outline of the ESSA identifications, one important note is that these are school level identifications based on school data. And then it's really 3 areas under ESSA for identification. And the first being comprehensive support and improvements, which we refer to as our CSI identification. And then we move into more targeted identifications, which really focus on specific student groups. So we see TSI and ATSI, so targeted intervention based on specific student groups within your data and your ESSA report. And then we move into a little bit more focused, additional targeted support and improvement, again, which is based on student groups within your report. So we can move on to the next slide. So here we look a little bit deeper at each of the identifications. And so for TSI, the targeted support and improvement is an annual identification. And it looks at 1 or more student groups performing in the bottom 10% across the state. And so this is something that, again, is very focused in the data specific to student groups. And then the next identification, which is additional targeted support and improvement, is a 3-year identification. And it, again, focuses on specific student groups within your report. And this is based on data looking at Title I receiving schools and performance falling into the bottom 5% of those schools. And then our most focused and intensive identification for ESSA is comprehensive support and improvement. And again, this is a 3-year identification cycle. And this looks at low performance for the bottom 5% of Title I receiving schools, which is based on a summary score within the ESSA report. And then another area of identification for CSI is for low graduation rate for schools that have a 12th grade, and that graduation rate falls below 67%. And that is, again, across Title I receiving schools. We can move on. Here we give an overview of the required actions that fall within each of those ESSA identifications. The X's indicate required actions for the identification. We do recommend, and you can see here that's noted on additional work and actions that we feel are best practices that should be incorporated. What's especially important to note are where we see X's for schools needing to identify an evidence-based improvement strategy that falls within the first 3 tiers of evidence. And then additionally, on the far right, what's important to note is who will be leading the review, approval, and monitoring of the continuous improvement work for the identifications. And so just really wanting to highlight that the LEA takes the lead in that review, approval, and monitoring for TSI and ATSI identifications, whereas the Title I continuous improvement team at DPI leads that review, approval, monitoring, and support for CSI identified schools. And we really try to do this in collaboration and partnership with our LEAs and school leaders. And so we really dedicate time to making sure that we are collaborating and calibrating on what the continuous improvement work is throughout the identification. And so once a school has been identified, we look at, and a lot of people are always anxious to know, what does it take to exit the identification? And so here we are focusing on exit criteria for CSI and ATSI. And the first criterion being that the school no longer meets identification criteria from the initial year and the current year. So really looking at those summary scores that are reported in their ESSA reports. The second being a demonstration of sustained and sustainable improvement towards the state long-term goals. And then in exit criterion 3 for CSI, we have really an opportunity to look at the evidence and the school demonstrating system structures and or procedures that ensure sustained and sustainable high quality improvement planning and practices that are in place school-wide. For ATSI, we look at those same areas, but really wanting to ensure that those systems, practices, planning, and procedures are really supporting the needs of the targeted student groups within their identification. So while we might see systems level work under the identifications, we really want to ensure that there's targeted efforts that are being made specific to the student groups within the identification. So that's just something key to note. And part of that evidence really must demonstrate that targeted work for the student groups in the identification. So when looking at the identification timeline, we know that there was a pause due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that has caused a shift in our timeline for a period, just really impacting our school's opportunities to exit. And so we are looking at now for our upcoming potential to exit, and then what happens if schools don't exit their identification with the timeline. So here towards the bottom of the slide, we see that for ATSI identifications, those schools that do not exit within a 6-year period will convert into a CSI identification. And the first cohort that this would apply to would move into that CSI identification during the 26-27 school year. And then our CSI identified schools have 4 years to exit to meet those 3 exit criterion. And if they don't after 4 years, they will then move into more rigorous intervention. This will apply to our first CSI cohort beginning in the 24-25 school year, which is starting next fall. And so more rigorous interventions are required for TSI identifications after the LEA determined number of years. So we really see that difference in requirements for the 3 SI identifications And then we see where some of those similarities lie more specifically across CSI and ATSI, and then the variance for our TSI identified schools, which is noted there. And I'm going to pass this back over to my IDEA team.
All right, thanks, Gloria. All right, folks, we'll dive into the IDEA side, at least for LEA determinations. I'll start this is one of the slide of the required actions, and then we'll dive into more of the specifics. But what you're seeing on the screen here, it really gives you an idea of the, obviously where the 4 categories fall, as I noted earlier. And in the spectrum of like what is the least severe to what is the most severe. The least severe obviously is if a district at LEA falls into the category of needs assistance. If a district falls into this category and it is their first year, there is no required action. We often treat this as what we call a warning year or a watch year. And so the district can and oftentimes do engage in continuous improvement, obviously, because that really helps the districts kind of plan ahead to ensure that the next year round of identification that they would not fall into the needs assistance category again, because if and when that does happen and they are identified as needs assistance the second time around and or more, that is when required actions start to take place for this particular determination category in that second year. You will also see there that districts who fall within this category of needs assistance, the percentage is there. Oftentimes you'll see that in LEA's JFN IDA report. 60 to 79% is essentially the score range that would allow a district to be in that needs assistance category. And then moving on, beyond that would be needs intervention, where that score is less than 60%. That is when, unlike the needs assistance category, the needs intervention category, then if there's a score of less than 60%, the required actions actually begin immediately. So even if it's the first year, because it's in this needs intervention category, the LEA is required to respond to required actions and submit additional improvement evidence requirements and WISE grants, as well as work alongside DPI by participating in our progress monitoring calls. And so that is the needs intervention category. And as I noted before, that upon 3 years of consecutive years finding, that's when it really shifts you into a much more narrowed, I would say, in a position where it puts the LEA in a position where they have oftentimes less control over the required action. So the corrective action plan is then directed then by the agency if that is the case for when a district is in this category 3 consecutive years. And then the most severe is districts who fall within the needs substantial intervention. As noted on the slide here, this isn't dependent on a certain score, usually because there's such an incomplete or inaccurate reporting of the data, which then does not allow DPI from issuing and being able to calculate and determine based off of the data that we'll take a look at the district, and oftentimes they're in this category. And then the required actions are much more a one-on-one working with some of our staff members on the special education team, and obviously meeting much more with the district to ensure that there is a system in place that is created and sustained to ensure that there's accurate reporting happening, and then reviewing to make sure that all of the compliance of the indicators are being met for districts that are in need substantial intervention. In IDA LEA determinations, there are 2 different types of indicators that we measure in the reports. There are results-based and also compliance. In the state of Wisconsin, how IDA LEA determinations work is that this is weighted, these two types of indicators are weighted equally half and half. So 50% are based off from results type indicators, such as graduation, dropouts, assessment participation, those are math and ELA, assessment proficiency, math and ELA, and then placement. So you'll see that results indicators tend to be a lot more outcomes based and outcomes driven. And then equally weighted as well, 50% of the LA determinations is really calculated based on the compliance measures, IDA Part C to Part B transitions, timely initial evaluations of students, post-secondary transition plans, corrected noncompliance, and then timely and accurate data reporting to DPI is all part of that compliance measuring of district's LEA determination. So together, that really gets you at that scoring that I showed earlier and ultimately places a district in that spectrum of either the least severe or the most severe. What you see on the slide here are the really specifics, kind of the detailed required actions of districts that fall into these buckets. So as I noted earlier, if a district is a needs assistance category and it's their first year, they don't have to do anything in terms of submitting anything to DPI. But if it is their second year or more, then that is where there are required actions for this first group of category, where the district is then required to access technical assistance. They are also then required to participate in quarterly progress monitoring calls, and then also complete the reports that is required prior to each calls that needs to be uploaded into WISE grants. The third is obviously before all the progress monitoring calls is that the district would need to submit evidence of improvement into WISE grants. And they include a few items that you see on the screen here, which is the very first thing is the continuous improvement plan, the root causes, SMART goals, evidence-based strategies, and then also reporting to DPI the supports that they're currently accessing to really work on their continuous improvement efforts and supporting and recognizing access for all students and education, especially students with IEPs. So that is the required actions for this group of districts in this category. The next one would be needs intervention. At this time, you'll see it's pretty much the same as the needs assistance year 2. And then needs substantial intervention. Again, this is the category where I would say the district would be, no longer in the driver's seat when it comes to really having control of making real changes and improving outcomes for students with IEPs, where DPI would then direct a corrective action plan, and then also restrictive withholding of IDA funds and or a referral to the Department of Justice. And then in this category, having quarterly progress monitoring calls with DPI and also reports. And these calls can happen much more often, obviously, depending on the district schedule as well, and their workings with our staff members here at the agency. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremiah to talk about the IDA racial equity report on the IDA side. So Jeremiah, I'll hand it over to you.
Cool. Thank you. So I should be pretty brief with the 2 slides that I have. I would just say that as part of the joint notification packets that do go out like annually, like LEA is provided with like an individualized, racial equity report. Like one of the things that we really do ask is that they're read through fully and completely. They do provide a lot of information, guidance, and instructions for what is required. And so basically like what's in the report is using the previous 3 years of data that's been supplied by the LEAs. is assessed for disproportionality in the areas of discipline, like identification and placement. And so straight from the report, it talks about that the purpose of this notification is to inform LEAs of racial disproportionality in special education based on the data that they submit to DPI. And that's one of the questions that we get often is, where does this data come from? It's the self-reported data by like any given LEA in their local student information system. And so what is shared with DPI, like the identifications are basically a composite of the previous 3 years data. And so following like the federal guidance, the goal of identifying disproportionality in these 3 categories is done to ensure that students of color are not being disciplined, like over identified or segregated from their peers at higher rates. And so basically having a risk ratio of 2.0 or greater in any of the categories regarding like the racialized categories of students will result in disproportionality identifications. And so as you can see on the map, you can see sort of like the districts and LEAs that have been highlighted for disproportionality for this particular like academic year. It's 51 in total right now. The thing that I can say, which I'm sure many of you know, is that, like disproportionality is happening outside and beyond just these 51 like identified, like LEAs. And so we do have, like a minimum cell size that has to be met in order to trigger those identifications. And so just wanted to highlight that even though it may not, show up on the map, it doesn't mean that it's not happening in other places. And so basically in terms of getting into like the racial equity report, yeah, like everybody gets one. And so, like I said, reading through like the information is really paramount to understand like what the current status is for a given year. And so basically, right away at the beginning of the report, it has like with the 3 different categories, either like indicated with a yes or a no, if disproportionality is occurring in those areas. If no, then no actions are required. But if yes, then continuous improvement is required. And so we can go to the next slide. All right, so if disproportionate, like LEAs are required to set aside 15% of the IDEA, I believe Part B formula funds to pay for these activities that will address the root causes. And so a budget needs to be entered. And as far as like the required actions, that's where we get into what needs to be done. It's indicated in the report as well, but we really start off with the 3 improvement monitoring calls. And as far as like those calls, like 3 is minimum. They're able to schedule more calls if they would like additional time with consultants from the team. I would say that one of the starting places really has to be the root cause analysis or review. And so to really lay the good foundation for the work that is to come, we really are looking to emphasize and support the root cause analysis and review work. From there, like LEAs are required to like identify factors and then strategies to address the current like identifications. And so that has to be entered into WISE grants as well as the budget. And so when we do get to the budget, we really want to ensure that that there's a through line from the identification or the identifications all the way through the factors, strategies, and how funds are being spent. And so there's a requirement to like identify SMART goals, and then we have what was the continuous improvement plan in years past has sort of been replaced with a continuous improvement planning document that is a live document, a Google document for right now, that at the end of the academic year, June 30th, we'll be able to upload those live documents into like like a PDF, and it will serve as like the artifact that gets recorded into WISE grants. And so as we're working through those 3 monitoring calls and any like additional calls, that continuous improvement like planning document really does serve as a roadmap, if you would, for the different elements and steps that they're required to engage in. And like I said, at the end, it turns into like the artifact for the year. And so the one thing that's not indicated on here is that students that are impacted through the use of the CCEIS funds, the Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services funds, need to be indicated and tracked in the local information system. And so there's usually like a CCEIS flag in those information systems where those students need to be like indicated who, was impacted through the use of the funds. We often get asked how to exit like these identifications, and essentially if there's a 0.25 reduction in 2 years time, like the identification would technically go away. But one of the things that we try to like emphasize is that in the spirit of continuous improvement, seeing this as an opportunity to use the funds to improve systems and outcomes for students, as opposed to something that is punitive or something that, we just need to do and we want to get out of it as fast as possible. It's really an opportunity to engage in some meaningful work like right now, but also some things that can be aligned more long term. And so the one last thing that I think I would say right now is just that if an LEA is also like identified as having needs assistance year 2 or needs interventions, they're required to follow the racial equity, these requirements, and as far as what they need to do for the continuous improvement work. So I'll probably go ahead and leave it there. I'm sure we'll have some questions, but we can field those at the end if that's okay. So I'll pass it back to you, Machu.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jeremiah. I know we've got a lot of questions around like, but what happens if you are identified as having sick disparole and also say needs assistance year 2? You would then be monitored through sick disparole and then having to complete the required actions as seen on here, on the screen here. You just wouldn't have to then submit all the required evidence for LA determinations, needs assistance year 2, but you're still required to engage and at a local level and retain that documentation and recording of those efforts to address that identification as well. It just is not required to be submitted to DPI on the LA determination side. So if folks got more questions on that, we can also go through it later on after today's presentation. So all of the reports that Gloria, myself, and Jeremiah went through, this gives you a brief kind of timeline outlook for when it gets released. So this is the preliminary and the final, the 2 different stages that the joint federal notification packets are then released. You all may have been familiar with how the timeline has been working from the years prior. This year, we're taking a little bit of a change in timeline. So the preliminary reports are released in late February, or will be released in late February of 2024 versus what would have been early December of 2023. So gives you an idea of the timeline shifting a bit. And in that preliminary release stage, the district will see in their SAFE portal or platform their ESSA accountability report, their IDA-LA determinations report, and then the district summary report. That third report, the district summary report, really pulls in together like a summary level bird's eye view of the identifications in both ESSA and IDA-LA determinations for the district to see. And then we'll do a final release of the same reports, as well as, in addition to that, the IDA racial equity and special education report in early April of 2024. That will be available and safe, and then for as a public app. I wonder, I think that's all that Gloria and Jeremiah, is there anything else that you two may want to add for these releases about the reports? With timelines, I think we should be good with
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
Uh,
like the only thing that I would just add is that one of the things that we're looking to do, like we've been attempting to kind of put this in place over the past year for sure, is so that for the 24, 25 identifications, we want to get information out shortly thereafter these identifications go out as far as the continuous improvement planning document, just so that work can get started on much earlier. In years past, it took a little bit longer to get started, and the way that I've been describing is really just trying to provide LEAs with like additional runway, so there's more time to engage in the work and things can get started in the spring, like over the summer, as opposed to really getting started in some cases in the fall. So we just want to provide an earlier start for folks as well.
yeah, super important for that. And then you all may like be asking, well, what's the difference between the two releases? Typically, we don't have, there's really not much of a difference between the reports that's released and preliminary and final. I think the biggest thing to know is final, that's where the IDA racial equity and special education report is then released. That's the only time we'll release it. It doesn't get released twice in preliminary. And then the second thing is oftentimes, I mean, there's been very few instances where the report, you know, based on the calculations and if there are any changes in the data, that gets updated, and then we'll notify and communicate to all appropriate districts where they see that being impacted. But for majority of the time, the reports and the results are pretty much the same between the preliminary release and then that final release that for April of 2024. All right, and then I just want to just point to the bottom of the slide here that again, every LA receives a JFM packet, so that every LA has data and support of continuous improvement work. We've got to remember that, you know, we are required by law to find a grounding of like a calculation and a measurement of what this looks like, but that doesn't mean that inequities aren't existing in those districts that are not identified. And so every LEA is encouraged to review, to assess, to build and sustain a system of support for all their students and their school district community members. Gloria, did you want to take the slide?
Yeah, so here's just a map giving just a visual representation of the SI identifications across the state. So we currently have 71 LEAs that have at least one or more SI identifications. And then across the state, we have 332 schools with one or more SI identification. So this just gives us a sense of the work that we're doing to support our schools with SI identifications across Wisconsin.
And then similarly, we have something similar, like a visual for LA determinations by CISA that you have there. But how to break it down in terms of the number of LEAs, 362 LEAs that met requirements, or it's just in that very first needs assistance year one, that watch year, warning year, where there's no required actions. And then the monitoring really starts around the 76 and the 12, where 76 LEAs were identified as needs assistance for multiple years, so 2 years or more, and then 12 LEAs in the needs intervention category. We will have, this is what we're calling like the GIS mapping. We will have, once the final release of the preliminary and the final reports are out, we'll then be able to provide and publish the latest GIS mappings of the identifications for both ESSA, IDA, LA determinations, and racial equity for folks who are kind of curious about when that's going to take place, sometime after May. And I would say midsummer is when we should probably have that set and ready for folks to have. And then I'll hand this over to Jeremiah.
Sorry about that. I was typing. So yeah, like I mentioned before, we have 51 LEAs that have been identified this academic year. So for 23-24, with significant racial disproportionality, and 11 of those were newly identified for this year. So you can see that from year to year, we typically have a lot of LEAs that continue. Which isn't necessarily always a bad thing. The one thing, like in trying to find like the opportunity in this work, is that like related to the funds, they have, so like LEAs have 27 months to spend the funds. And so in years past, folks have kind of gotten started late, like budgets, maybe not until November at the earliest, December. And so it was kind of like a rush to try to spend the funds by June 30th. But we really are trying to, like I said, provide a little bit more runway, but also like with our SMART goals and our planning, if we, are visualizing or realizing that it might take a little bit more time than just that academic year alone, we can stretch the work into the following year as well. So yeah, like excited about the work. I mean, like I said, for me, I don't look at it in that punitive sense. Like I look at it as an opportunity to like improve our outcomes and our systems and structures for our students, staff, and families. So that's where we are, but hopefully we'll continue to move forward. So thank you, Machua.
And then I always really like this visual because it really gives folks like a all-in-one look of all the districts identified in the different areas. How many districts have various combinations between all three, as you can see, 12 there in the latest 2022 data, 12 districts that were both identified for both ESSA, IDA racial equity, and also LA determinations. And so I like to think of this as kind of like the final kind of visual that really encapsulates where districts are at when it comes to identification and how those numbers are showing up, because that definitely reveals a story in itself within the data. So just wanted to share this for folks to have and really reflect on what this work really means for the state of Wisconsin.
And so as a wrap up here, we just want to give another visual and represent the idea that Machua gave a really nice summary and overview in the beginning of the purpose of joint federal notifications. And it's really to look at how do we keep the work aligned, supported, connected, so that it feels more of a unified approach and really supporting continuous improvement efforts at the district and school levels. And so really wanting to make sure the work does not feel redundant, it does not feel like it's competing, and that we're really taking this approach of looking at our identifications holistically and how can we build those connections, regardless if it's an LEA level identification or school level identification. We really want to see the connections and support the alignment and how we're implementing best practices to really improve outcomes for students and support improve practices for the staff in our buildings and districts. So this visual just really kind of gives us that reminder and really what this work is intended to do. So we really appreciate your time and listening today. I think we are opening up to questions for a brief period of time, whether in the chat or if people are coming off of mute.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, Machua, Gloria, and Jeremiah. What a great overview and some really nice information and some powerful and comprehensive visuals with the maps and the circles or the Venn diagram that you showed. That was really powerful. I do not see anything in the parking lot document. Team, did you see anything dropped in chat that I may have missed? I'm seeing heads shaking no. So participants, if anyone has a question, I invite you to use the raise hand feature. Or for sure, turn on your camera and, maybe wave at me so I can see you. We'll give you a minute or so to think if you have a question for this team. This is the weird odd pause as facilitator that I feel like I should fill because a minute feels like an eternity. I am not seeing anyone flip their camera on or wildly raise their hand. So with that, again, I would extend a thank you to all of our presenters today, but specifically the ones that just presented. Thank you so much. And to everyone still on the call, I just would, from RSN, DPI, WCAS, we just want to wish you all a relaxing winter break and a healthy new year. Our next virtual leaders event is January 10th. And the following topics are on the docket. So mental health services and IEPs, and then related services with Carlin Higby and Dawn Mirth Johnson. And we would just remind you that is a 3-hour. So that one starts at 9 o'clock. Registration is through CISA 8. So thank you again, everyone. Have a healthy, happy new year, and we'll see you in 2024.